Throughout human history, there have been extraordinary individuals who dared to challenge the very foundations of their world. These weren't just brilliant minds, they were revolutionaries who stood against entire systems, faced ridicule, persecution, and sometimes even death, all because they saw what others couldn't see, believed what others wouldn't believe, and refused to accept what everyone else considered unchangeable truth. What drives a person to stand alone against the weight of established knowledge, powerful institutions, and societal expectations? What compels someone to risk everything, their reputation, their livelihood, even their life, for an idea that the world isn't ready to accept? Today, we're going to explore the fascinating stories of geniuses who didn't just think outside the box, they shattered it completely. Consider this. Every revolutionary idea we take for granted today was once considered heretical, impossible, or downright dangerous. The notion that the Earth revolves around the Sun, the concept that invisible germs cause disease, the idea that humans could fly, or that information could travel instantly across the globe. All of these were once met with fierce opposition from the very institutions and experts who were supposed to champion knowledge and progress. These stories aren't just about scientific breakthroughs or technological innovations. They're about the profound human capacity to see beyond the limitations imposed by society, to question authority when everyone else accepts it blindly, and to persist in the face of overwhelming opposition. They're about individuals who possess not just intellectual brilliance but extraordinary courage. The courage to be wrong in public, to be ridiculed by peers, and to maintain faith in their vision when the entire world seemed to prove them wrong. What's particularly fascinating is how these geniuses often shared common traits that put them at odds with established systems. They possessed an almost childlike curiosity that refused to accept because that's how it's always been done, as a valid explanation. They had an uncanny ability to see patterns and connections that others missed, often because they approach problems from completely unexpected angles. Most importantly, they had an unshakable belief in the power of evidence and reason over tradition and authority. But here's what makes their stories even more compelling. The systems that opposed them weren't necessarily evil or malicious. Often, these were well-intentioned institutions, universities, religious organizations, governments, scientific academies, that genuinely believed they were protecting society from dangerous ideas or maintaining important stability. The conflict between genius and system wasn't always a battle between good and evil. It was often a clash between innovation and preservation, between the unknown future and the familiar past. As we embark on this journey through history, we'll discover how these remarkable individuals not only overcame the obstacles placed before them, but often transformed those very obstacles into stepping stones toward greatness. We'll see how rejection by one system led them to create entirely new frameworks of understanding, how persecution strengthened their resolve, and how their apparent failures often contained the seeds of their ultimate triumph. These are stories of human potential unleashed, of the incredible things that become possible when brilliant minds refuse to be constrained by conventional wisdom. They remind us that progress isn't just about having good ideas. It's about having the courage to defend those ideas when the world isn't ready to hear them. Let's begin our journey with perhaps one of the most famous confrontations between genius and system in human history. A story that literally moved the Earth from the center of the universe and forever changed how we see our place in the cosmos. Picture the year 1543. For over 1,000 years, the entire Western world had accepted without question that Earth was the center of the universe, with the sun, moon, and all the stars revolving around us in perfect celestial harmony. This wasn't just scientific doctrine, it was religious truth, philosophical certainty, and common sense all rolled into one. After all, didn't everyone feel the solid, unmoving ground beneath their feet? Didn't they see the sun rise in the east and set in the west every single day? Into this world of absolute certainty stepped Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer whose revolutionary idea would shake the very foundations of human understanding. But here's what makes his story so compelling. Copernicus wasn't some radical rebel looking to overturn society. He was a respected church canon, a medical doctor, an economist, and a mathematician who had spent decades quietly observing the heavens and growing increasingly troubled by what he saw. The problem was mathematical elegance, or rather, the complete lack of it in the accepted system. The Earth-centered model required increasingly complex explanations to account for the observed movements of planets. Astronomers had to invent elaborate loops within loops, called epicycles, to explain why planets sometimes appeared to move backward in their orbits. The system had become so convoluted that it resembled a cosmic Rube Goldberg machine rather than the divine perfection that scholars expected from God's creation. Copernicus spent over 30 years developing his heliocentric theory, the radical notion that the Sun, not Earth, was the center of our solar system. But he understood the explosive nature of his discovery. This wasn't just challenging scientific orthodoxy, it was threatening the entire medieval worldview that placed humanity at the center of God's creation. If Earth was just another planet spinning through space, what did that say about humanity's special relationship with the divine? The genius of Copernicus lay not just in his astronomical observations, but in his ability to see beyond the obvious. While everyone else looked at the sky and saw the sun moving around Earth, Copernicus asked a different question. What if it only appears that way because we're the ones who are moving? It was a profound shift in perspective that required him to imagine standing outside the Earth and viewing the solar system from an entirely different vantage point. For decades, Copernicus kept his revolutionary theory largely to himself, sharing it only with a small circle of trusted colleagues. He knew that publication would bring not just scientific criticism, but potential charges of heresy. The Catholic Church had built much of its theological framework around the Earth-centered universe, and challenging that meant challenging the Church's authority to interpret both Scripture and nature. Legend has it that Copernicus received the first printed copy of his masterwork, On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, on his deathbed in 1543. Whether true or not, this story captures the profound courage required to challenge an entire worldview. He was literally betting his life's work and reputation on an idea that contradicted everything his contemporaries believed to be true. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Copernicus was both right and wrong simultaneously. He was absolutely correct that the Sun was the center of our solar system, but he still believed in perfectly circular orbits and thought the universe was much smaller than it actually is. His system, while revolutionary in concept, was still flawed in execution. Yet this imperfection makes his achievement even more remarkable. He was willing to publish an incomplete theory because he understood that truth emerges through investigation and debate, not through blind acceptance of authority. The real vindication of Copernicus would come decades later through the work of Kepler, Galileo, and others who built upon his foundation. But his courage to question the unquestionable, to imagine the unimaginable, and to publish the unpublishable created the first crack in a worldview that had seemed unshakable for centuries. The courage of Copernicus to challenge astronomical orthodoxy was just the beginning. 70 years later, another brilliant mind would take up the torch of scientific revolution. But this time, the price of defying the system would be far more personal and devastating. Galileo Galilei didn't just read about Copernicus's theory, he proved it. Armed with a revolutionary new instrument called the telescope, which he had improved and perfected himself, Galileo became the first human being to truly see the heavens as they actually were, not as ancient authorities claimed they should be. Picture the astonishment of peering through that primitive telescope in 1609 and discovering that the moon wasn't a perfect, smooth celestial sphere as Aristotle had taught, but a world of mountains and craters much like Earth. Imagine the shock of pointing that same instrument at Jupiter and finding four moons orbiting around it. Clear, undeniable proof that not everything in the universe revolved around Earth. And then came the most devastating evidence of all. Observing Venus go through phases just like our moon, something that could only happen if Venus orbited the Sun, not Earth. For Galileo, these weren't just abstract theoretical discoveries. They were direct, observable evidence that completely vindicated Copernicus. The universe had revealed its secrets to him personally, and he felt compelled to share these revelations with the world. But unlike Copernicus, who had the luxury of keeping his theories largely private until his death, Galileo lived in an age where the Catholic Church had become far more aggressive about defending its doctrinal authority. The Counter-Reformation was in full swing, and the Church was hypersensitive to any challenge that might undermine its position as the ultimate arbiter of truth. When Galileo published his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632, he wasn't just presenting scientific evidence, he was directly challenging the Church's interpretation of Scripture and its authority to determine what educated people were allowed to think about the natural world. What makes Galileo's story so compelling is that he genuinely believed he could convince the Church through reason and evidence. He was a devout Catholic who saw no conflict between his faith and his scientific discoveries. In his mind, God had given humanity both Scripture and the ability to observe nature, and both should lead to the same truth. He famously wrote that, "The Bible shows the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go." But institutional power rarely yields to individual genius, no matter how compelling the evidence. In 1633, at the age of 69, Galileo found himself standing before the Roman Inquisition, forced to choose between his life's work and his life itself. The man who had seen farther into the cosmos than any human before him was threatened with torture and death unless he recanted everything he knew to be true. The trial was a masterpiece of institutional intimidation. Galileo was shown the instruments of torture, reminded of what had happened to other heretics who had refused to submit to church authority, and ultimately forced to kneel and formally abjure his scientific findings. The words he was compelled to speak must have felt like poison in his mouth. "I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. I swear that in the future I will never again say or assert anything that might furnish occasion for a similar suspicion regarding me." Legend tells us that as Galileo rose from his knees after this forced confession, he whispered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Whether he actually spoke these words or not, they capture the essence of what makes genius so dangerous to rigid systems. Truth has a way of persisting even when it's officially suppressed. The Church could silence Galileo, place him under house arrest for the rest of his life, and ban his books, but they couldn't stop the Earth from orbiting the Sun. They couldn't make Jupiter's moons disappear or change the phases of Venus. Most importantly, they couldn't prevent other minds from looking through telescopes and seeing the same undeniable evidence that had convinced Galileo. Even under house arrest, Galileo continued his work, writing his greatest contribution to physics, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences, which laid the groundwork for Newton's later breakthroughs. The system had broken his body and restricted his freedom, but it couldn't imprison his mind or stop the scientific revolution he had helped to ignite.